Hi everyone, I hope you're doing well. Congrats on it only being a couple weeks till the semester's over. I hope everything has gone well for you guys and continues to finish well. I'm recording this at the school that I work at, so I apologize if there's any unexpected noise. But basically, for my book review for the class, I read For the Glory by Duncan Hamilton. And perhaps some of you are familiar with the film Chariots of Fire, which came out in 1981. This film popularized Eric Liddell and his story. But basically, Duncan Hamilton felt that the movie left the audience with an incomplete picture of Liddell. And even in the story, he brings up several instances of parts of the film that perhaps gave an incomplete story of the narrative and what actually happened in Liddell's life, or it was just completely false. And so he was fascinated by Eric Liddell and wanted to write a book that gave the complete story because he felt like Liddell's life was worth reading and worth knowing in full. And so I read his book for the book review for this class, and I have my paper here. So I'm essentially just going to go through some of the main parts of it, tell you about Liddell's story, and that'll be it. So Hamilton divides his book into three parts. And the first part goes through Liddell's early life and his athletic career. Eric Liddell was born in China in 1902 to Scottish missionaries who were serving in China. And so even from his early years, he had the desire to serve in China as well and wanted to follow in his parents' footsteps. But he and his brother Rob were enrolled in Eltham College in London when they were like 8 and 9. And so pretty much after that point, he was separated from his family for most of his life. But it was at this college that he and his brother developed their athletic skills and really showed off what they could do. And Liddell specifically rose to the top, even above his brother. And that's where his athletic career really got underway. And so by the time he got to Edinburgh University, when he was older, everyone could tell he was a really good runner. And so he continued to run and compete, and eventually it was seen that he could be an Olympic contender. And so he and his coach, Tom, I think it's McKirker, I could be pronouncing it wrong, but he and his coach trained extensively. And even though Liddell was a really good runner, he had unconventional form. And so most people doubted him. And even going into the Paris Olympics in 1924, most people thought there was no way he had a chance and didn't think much of him. But his coach knew, and I think deep down he knew. And so he did compete. There's a famous story where he didn't compete in the 100-meter race, which was his best event, because it was on a Sunday. And it's seen even from that moment on the world stage, making that decision to say, no, I'm going to keep the Sabbath because that's the right thing to do. His Christianity and his values and his morals were seen. And he stuck to it. And so he didn't get to run his best race, but he won gold in the 220 meters. I think it's the 220 meters. Let me recheck that actually. It was the 440 meters. So he ran that and he won Olympic gold and even broke the world record. So it was incredible, and everyone saw just what a good runner he really was. And so obviously Liddell could have, continued his Olympic career for long after 1924 in those games in Paris. But he had always decided that his athletic career was not the goal of his life. That athletics was part of his life, but it was not the goal. His goal had always been from the start to return to China and to be a missionary there and to serve there as long as he could. And so that's what he did. And again, the world was like in shock because not only had he chosen not to run in that race on that Sunday, but now he was giving up more opportunity for more athletic fame and more glory to go serve these people in China. And so he decided to go back to China. And for a while, he was a teacher at a school in China. And he during that time is when he learned the language, and he worked on I guess essentially like building his missionary credentials, and getting some experience under his belt. And then the next part of the book kind of talks about his marriage and some of the political turmoil that developed in China, and essentially and eventually led to World War II, which is the main focus of the third part of the book. But the second part builds the stage for that. So Lytle married Florence Mackenzie in March 1934. And she, just like Lytle, had the heart for missions. They had the same vision and the same goals. And so they were married, and they, pretty soon after their marriage, had 2 daughters. And actually, they eventually had 3 daughters. But because of the political turmoil that was coming, and because of some other things that I'll get to later, Lytle never got to meet his 3rd daughter. But they did have 2 early on, Patricia and Heather, and for a while, for most of their early life, he was with them. However, and now moving on to the third part of the book, the political turmoil in China was building because there was a lot of ideological war between the nationalists and the communists throughout China. However, there was also the feature of Japan's gradual expansion into China. And so things were tense, and Japan was slowly moving closer to taking hold of China. And so slowly things began to clamp down, almost like they did in the pandemic, where there was tension and there were rules, and everyone could just feel that things were coming. And there was also the civil war between the nationalists and the communists. And so there was just a lot of turmoil, a lot of chaos, that eventually led to Lytle having to be put on house arrest. But before this, Lytle was a missionary with the London Missionary Society, and they asked him to move into a more rural part of China to do missions there, because he had been teaching at a school that was more in like the city, in the affluent part of China. And so he was asked to move there, and he got to move there with his wife and with his girls. But shortly after he moved there is when all this turmoil really heightened. And so Florence and the girls had to move to Canada, and she was actually pregnant at the time, and Lytle never got to see any of them again, because eventually, as things got really, really bad and World War II broke out, the Japanese took hold of China completely, and he was sent to a prisoner of war camp in that rural area, and he eventually died there. But before his death in that camp, he did everything he could to reach the people there, to encourage them, because it was an awful time when people were hurting and people were confused and they were lost. And the conditions in the camp were horrible. The people were starving. Tons of diseases were rampant. They were deprived of many essential things like clothes, proper shelter, again, food. People were starving. But Lytle used every bit of strength and every bit of opportunity that the Lord gave him to encourage others, especially kids. He couldn't be with his own kids, but they eventually, even his own kids said eventually that, they couldn't have him, but other kids needed him. And so eventually it was seen that Lytle had developed a tumor in his brain from a previous race that he had been in when he first got back to China after the Olympics. And he actually did continue to run a little bit here and there. He would do fun competitions. There were even some in the camp. So he continued to use that skill, but he never ran Olympically again. And the tumor in his brain eventually caused several strokes, and he passed away. But as all of this shows, Lytle was an incredible man, and I really enjoyed getting to read this story about him because I had known of him before this, and I think, as I said even in my paper, we all have this category of missionaries that we've heard either through school or church or other things depending on our backgrounds. But it was really nice to do an in-depth look into a man of such character and humility, and I thought the book was really good, and I thought some of his characteristics really stuck out, that he was humble and he was selfless and he was resilient. And so I encourage you guys to read this book if you'd like to. Thanks.